The rain had teeth that night. It bit through the silk canopy of Lord Fenton's garden party and sent the guests shrieking toward the house like a flock of jeweled, useless birds. Vivian Pembroke did not shriek. She stood beneath the dripping edge of a stone gazebo and watched them scatter, and she felt nothing at all. This was her 4th London season, 4 years of being trotted out in borrowed gowns and pinching shoes. 4 years of her mother's fingers digging into her arm and hissing smile wider, stand straighter, be more. 4 seasons and not a single offer, not because she was plain, she was not, though she would never have said so herself. She had dark hair that refused to hold a fashionable curl and steady brown eyes that unsettled people. They were eyes that saw too much. That was the problem. She saw through things, through people, and society did not care for a woman who could see through them. Her mother, Lady Constance Pembroke, cared even less. Lady Constance was a woman built for ballrooms the way a hawk is built for open sky, sharp, relentless, and always circling something she intended to devour. She had married well once and spent badly ever since. The Pembroke fortune, never vast to begin with, had been whittled away by her father's opium habit and her mother's desperate maintenance of appearances. The townhouse in Mayfair was mortgaged. The country estate in Wiltshire had been sold 2 years ago, quietly, to a merchant who now used it as a hunting lodge. They were living on the thinnest possible edge of respectability, and Lady Constance clung to that edge with both manicured hands. Tonight, as the rain drove the party indoors, Vivian watched something that changed everything. A man was crossing the far end of the garden, one of the hired laborers brought in to set up the tents and carry the crates of champagne. He was caught in a downpour, soaked through, his rough coat plastered to his shoulders. He could have run for shelter. He did not. He had stopped because an old stray cat, the kind of ragged, half-blind creature that haunted the alleys behind these grand houses, was huddled against a garden wall, trembling. The man knelt in the mud. He did not grab the animal or shoo it away. He simply took off his coat, the only coat he had from the look of it, and draped it gently over the shivering creature. Then he stood, coatless now, rain streaming down his face, and walked on as if it were nothing, as if kindness in this world cost nothing at all. Vivian felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, crack, the way ice cracks on a pond in early spring when the water beneath is ready to move again. She did not know his name. She did not know anything about him, but she knew with a certainty that frightened her that she had just witnessed the truest thing she had seen in 4 years of manufactured smiles and hollow courtship. The next morning, her mother delivered the news like a verdict. Lord Devereux had made an offer. Vivian was sitting in the cramped parlor of their rented rooms, mending a stocking. She put down her needle. Lord Devereux was 53 years old. He had buried 2 wives and was known, in the careful euphemisms of polite society, as a man of strong appetites. His hands were always damp. His laugh sounded like something being squeezed. He was also extraordinarily rich. "He will settle every debt," Lady Constance said, pacing the worn carpet, a sheaf of creditors' letters fanned in her hand like a losing hand of cards. "Every last one. Your father's mess, the rent on these rooms, the dressmaker, the butcher, all of it, gone. And you will be Lady Devereux. You will have a house in Belgravia and a country estate in Hampshire and more money than we have ever dreamed of." "And what will it cost?" Vivian asked. "Cost?" Her mother laughed, a brittle sound. "It costs you nothing. You gain everything. I gain a husband who frightens me." The room went very still. Lady Constance's smile did not waver, but something behind it hardened into stone. "You will accept him," she said. "You will accept him or we are finished. Do you understand? Not embarrassed, not diminished. Finished. Your father will go to debtor's prison. I will be turned out into the street, and you, my darling girl, will discover what it truly means to have nothing." Vivian looked at her mother's face, at the desperation poorly masked by rouge and determination. and she understood something with terrible clarity. Her mother was not asking. Her mother was selling. "I need a day," Vivian said. "You have until tomorrow evening. Lord Devereux dines with us at 8. That night, Vivian did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the cracked ceiling and thought about the man in the rain. She thought about his hands, careful and unhurried, draping his coat over a stray cat. She thought about what it meant to give away your only coat for something that could never repay you. By dawn, a plan had taken shape in her mind. It was absurd. It was reckless. It was the act of a mad woman or a saint, and she was neither. But it was hers. The only thing left that was hers. She found him on the third try. The first 2 laborers she asked near Lord Fenton's estate shrugged and turned away. The third, a boy hauling crates from a cart, squinted at her description. Tall fellow, quiet, reads a lot. He jerked his thumb eastward. Thomas Wren, lodges at Mrs. Finch's place on Brier Lane. Does carpentry, odd jobs, keeps to himself. Brier Lane was a street that smelled of coal smoke and boiled turnips. Number 4 was a narrow brick building with a blue door, the paint peeling in long curls. Vivian stood before it, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She knocked, the door opened, and there he was, Thomas Wren. Without the rain and the darkness, he was sharper, more defined. Late 20s, perhaps 30. A face all angles lean and weathered, with a jaw that looked carved from something unyielding. Dark blonde hair pushed back from his forehead. And his eyes, they were green, a deep, unsettling green, the color of old glass or deep water. They held a steadiness that she found both reassuring and unnerving, as though he had already seen everything the world could show him and had decided, quietly, not to look away. He did not speak. He leaned against the doorframe and waited. "My name is Vivian Pembroke," she said. Her rehearsed speech had evaporated. "I saw you 2 nights ago, in Lord Fenton's garden. You gave your coat to a stray cat. Something moved in those green eyes. Not warmth, exactly. Weariness. I have a proposal for you," she pressed on, before he could close the door. "A business arrangement. I need a husband, and I need one today." The silence that followed was enormous. Somewhere above them, a window opened, and a woman emptied a basin of water into the street. "You're out of your mind," he said. His voice was low, rough, stripped of any ornament. "Possibly," she admitted, "but I am also out of options," she told him. Not the polished version, not the version designed to elicit sympathy. She told him the ugly truth. The debts, the mother, Lord Devereux's damp hands and dead wives, the cage closing around her. She told him she had £40, every penny she had saved from selling her books and a garnet brooch that had been her grandmother's. She told him she was not looking for love or rescue. She was looking for a door. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He looked at her hands, which were trembling, though the rest of her was perfectly still. "If I did this," he said slowly, "and I am not saying I will, there would be rules. Name them. This is a name on a paper, nothing more. You will not be my wife. I will not be your husband. We share a roof, not a life. Agreed. The money stays with you. I don't want it." This stopped her. She had expected negotiation, maybe greed. Not this. Why? "Because I am not for sale either, Miss Pembroke." The faintest ghost of something, not a smile, but the memory of one, crossed his face. "You'll keep it. You may need it someday, and I won't be the reason you have nothing." "And the third condition? You live as I live. No carriages, no servants, no silk. This." He gestured at the cramped hallway behind him, the narrow staircase, the faint smell of wood shavings and soap. "Can you do that?" She looked past him into the dim hallway. She thought of Lord Devereux's Belgravia mansion, its cold marble and colder master. She thought of her mother's rented rooms, suffocating with pretense. "Yes," she said, "I can." He studied her for another long moment, then he nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion, like a man stepping off a cliff. "Then let's not waste daylight, Miss Pembroke." They were married an hour later in a chapel so small it barely qualified as a building. The vicar was ancient and nearly deaf. The witnesses were a charwoman and her son, bribed with 2 shillings each. The ring was tin, purchased from a pawnbroker's tray for 6pence. It sat on Vivian's finger like a question she could not yet answer. There was no kiss, no music, no flowers, just 2 strangers standing in a cold room, making promises that felt like jumping from a great height and trusting the ground to be kind. The rooms at Mrs. Finch's were 2 small spaces that smelled of beeswax and old wood, a sitting room with a scarred table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace that drew poorly. A bedroom with a narrow bed and a single window. Thomas gave her the bedroom and took the floor in the sitting room without discussion. She did not argue. The arrangement between them had its own fragile architecture, and she was afraid to touch any wall for fear the whole thing would collapse. The first days were defined by silence. Thomas left before dawn for whatever work he could find, carpentry, hauling, repairs, and returned in the evening, tired and dust-covered and uncomplaining. He would wash his hands and face, eat whatever she had managed to cook, and then sit by the fire with a book. Always a book. She noticed the titles: Marcus Aurelius, Montaigne, a water-stained volume of Shakespeare's histories, heavy reading for a laborer. It nagged at her like a splinter she could feel, but not see. She learned to cook from Mrs. Finch, a stout, no-nonsense woman who had raised 5 children alone and had opinions about everything. The first morning, Vivian had burned porridge so badly the pot had to be thrown out. Mrs. Martival, Finch had looked at the smoking wreckage and said, "Well, that's one way to season cast iron." By the end of the week, Vivian could produce a passable stew and a loaf of bread that was only slightly lopsided. She learned the neighborhood too. She learned that the girl upstairs, Nell, took in washing and sang hymns while she worked, her voice high and clear and heartbreaking. She learned that the old man at the end of the lane, Mr. Falk, was blind and that Thomas brought him a meal every Sunday without being asked. She learned that the children in the street called Thomas the Quiet One, and that he had once mended a boy's broken kite without a word and handed it back as if it were a matter of no consequence. She watched him. She could not help it. He was a puzzle whose pieces did not fit the picture on the box. His hands, when they worked, moved with a precision that spoke of training, not just practice. His speech, rare as it was, held no dropped consonants, no laborer's slang. When he read, his lips moved slightly, and once she caught him tracing a passage in Latin with his finger. A carpenter who read Latin. A man who gave away his coat and refused £40. None of it added up. One evening, 10 days into their strange arrangement, he came home with blood on his knuckles. He said nothing about it. He washed his hands in the basin, wincing slightly, and sat down to eat. Vivian set down his soup and then, without asking, brought a clean rag and a jar of salve she had gotten from Mrs. Finch. "Give me your hand," she said. He looked at her, surprised. Then he extended his hand, palm down, across the table. His knuckles were split and swelling. She cleaned them carefully, her fingers gentle on his skin. It was the first time they had touched since the day he had helped her into the chapel. "What happened?" she asked. "A disagreement. With whom?" "A man who was hitting his dog." She looked up at him. His green eyes were calm, unapologetic. Of course, she thought. Of course it was that. "You cannot fix every broken thing in the world, Thomas." "No," he agreed. "But I can fix the ones in front of me." Something shifted between them after that night. The silence remained, but it softened. It became comfortable, inhabited, the silence of two people who had stopped being strangers and had not yet decided what to become instead. He began leaving small things for her. A sprig of wildflowers in a chipped cup on the table, a book of poetry with no note. She began saving him the end piece of bread, the one with the most crust, because she had noticed he preferred it. It was not love, not yet. It was the soil in which love might grow, if given enough rain and enough time. 3 weeks after the wedding, their fragile peace shattered. Thomas came home early, his expression dark and set. "We need to leave London," he said. The words hit her like cold water. "My mother and Lord Devereux's, they've petitioned to have the marriage annulled. They are petitioned to have the marriage annulled. They are claiming you were coerced, that you were not competent to consent. Devereux is calling in favors. He has friends in the courts." Fear coiled in her stomach, old and familiar. "Where will we go? Somewhere safe. Somewhere they cannot reach." "Where is that?" He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something cross his face that she had never seen before. Not fear. Resignation. "Home," he said. They left at dawn in a carriage that had no business being on Brier Lane. It was plain but well made, drawn by 2 matched greys worth more than everything on the street combined. Vivian stared at it. "A friend's," Thomas said in a tone that closed the subject. They traveled north for 2 days. London fell away, replaced by green hills and stone walls and the widening sky. Thomas barely spoke during the journey. He stared out the window with the expression of a man returning to a battlefield. Vivian watched him and felt the distance between them stretch taut as a wire. On the second evening, the carriage turned onto a private road lined with ancient elms. The road went on and on, impossibly long, bending through manicured parkland where deer lifted their heads to watch them pass. Vivian's bewilderment curdled into dread. The house appeared like a revelation. It was enormous, built of pale grey stone that glowed amber in the setting sun. Wings spread out from a central portico supported by columns. Hundreds of windows caught the dying light. Formal gardens cascaded down to a lake that burned gold. The carriage stopped. The great doors opened. A line of servants poured out, their faces slack with shock. An elderly man in black, ramrod straight, descended the steps. His composure held, but barely. "Your lordship," he said, his voice cracking on the second word. "We had feared." "I am well, Pritchard," Thomas said. But his voice had changed. The roughness was gone, replaced by something clipped and certain. The voice of command. Replaced by something clipped and certain. The voice of command. "This is my wife, the Marchioness. See that the West Wing is prepared." Marchioness. Vivian turned to look at the man beside her. He met her gaze, and in his green eyes she saw the truth he had been carrying like a stone in his chest. "My name," he said quietly, "is Julian Ashford, Marquess of Thornfield." "I am sorry, Vivian. I should have told you." She did not cry. She did not scream. She stared at him, at this stranger who had been a stranger all along, and she said in a voice so controlled it frightened them both, "Yes, you should have." She did not speak to him for 3 days. She moved through the vast, echoing halls of Thornfield Park like a ghost, trailed by a terrified lady's maid named Alice. The rooms were exquisite and suffocating. The dining room seated 40. Her bedroom alone was larger than the entire flat on Brier Lane. She ate her meals alone and tasted nothing. On the 4th day, she found the greenhouse. It was a beautiful glass structure at the rear of the east wing, clearly once someone's pride. Now it was dying. The orchids had shriveled. The ferns had browned. Dust lay thick on every surface. A single lemon tree stood in the center, its leaves curled and yellow. She found a watering can and began. Julian discovered her there an hour later, on her knees in the dirt, her dress ruined, carefully cutting away dead growth from a rosebush. "That was my sister's," he said from the doorway. "Charlotte. She built this greenhouse. She died of typhus 3 years ago. I left after. I could not bear this house without her. Every room had her voice in it." Vivian did not look up. She kept pruning, her cuts precise and deliberate. "So you ran away," she said. "Yes, and became Thomas Wren. A man with no title, no estate, no memories, a man who could disappear, and then a stranger showed up on your doorstep and you married her and dragged her into your disappearance without telling her the truth. Yes, his voice was raw. I have no defense, Vivian. I was selfish. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. From this house, from who I am in it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him for the first time in 3 days. He stood in the doorway of his dead sister's greenhouse, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been running from grief and had finally, painfully, run out of road. "This tree is not dead," she said, gesturing at the lemon tree. "It is neglected. There is a difference. Dead things cannot be saved. Neglected things just need someone to come back." She was not talking about the tree. He knew it. She knew it. The greenhouse was silent except for the distant sound of birdsong through the glass. The next morning she came down for breakfast and found that the long formal table had been replaced by a small round table set in the window bay, laid for 2. Julian was already seated, reading a letter. He looked up when she entered. "Good morning, Vivian," he said. It was the first time her name had sounded like an offering rather than a formality. "Good morning, Julian," she replied. She sat. The sunlight was warm on her face. The tea was strong and good. For the first time since arriving at Thornfield, she felt the knot in her chest begin, very slowly, to loosen. The Dowager Marchioness arrived a week later, in a lacquered carriage with a coat of arms on the door and an expression that could have frozen the Thames. Lady Helena Ashford was small, silver-haired, and possessed of a gaze that could pin a person to the wall like a butterfly in a collector's case. She swept into the drawing-room, looked Vivian up and down, and said, "You are not what I pictured." "I rarely am, your ladyship," Vivian said. A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, approval, crossed the old woman's face. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you are. Sit down, girl. We have a great deal to discuss, and I despise standing." Vivian told her everything: the debts, the mother, Lord Devereux, the chapel wedding, the flat on Brier Lane. She left nothing out, because she sensed that this woman, like herself, had no patience for edited truths. When she finished, Lady Helena was quiet for a long time. She looked at the portrait of her granddaughter Charlotte that hung above the fireplace, a laughing girl with Julian's green eyes. "He wrote to me," Lady Helena said softly. "The first letter in 3 years. He told me about a woman who showed up on his doorstep and proposed to a carpenter. He said she was the most stubborn person he had ever met." She turned back to Vivian, and her sharp eyes were unexpectedly kind. "He also said you have started bringing the greenhouse back to life. Charlotte would have liked that. I am not trying to replace her." "No, you are not. That is precisely why it matters." The Dowager straightened in her chair. "Now, this business with your mother and that revolting Lord Devereux, they are making noise in London. We must make more. It is time for the Marquess and Marchioness of Thornfield to reintroduce themselves to society." "A ball," Vivian said, understanding. "A ball," Lady Helena confirmed, with a smile that was equal parts warmth and war. Julian resisted. The thought of London, of the endless scrutiny, of stepping back into the life he had shed like a second skin, it filled him with a dread he could taste. But his grandmother, with her unanswerable logic, and Vivian, with her quiet, steady certainty, wore him down. "You cannot hide forever, Julian," Lady Helena said. "This title is not a costume you can take off. It is a responsibility, and your first responsibility is to your wife." He looked at Vivian. She said nothing, but her eyes held a question that was also an answer. She had trusted him. She had given up everything familiar on the strength of a stranger's handshake. He owed her more than silence. "Very well," he said. "We go to London." They returned to the city not in secrecy but in state. Thornfield House on Berkeley Square was opened, staffed, and lit for the first time in 3 years. Invitations were dispatched. The ball would be the event of the season. Vivian was fitted for a new wardrobe. Lady Helena insisted. "No borrowing, no hand-me-downs, no costumes. You are not performing a role," she said. "You are becoming yourself." The gowns they chose were simple and striking, deep burgundy, midnight blue, and for the ball itself, a gown of ivory silk so finely cut it seemed to move like water. During the preparations, something changed between Julian and Vivian. They were allies now, conspirators with a shared purpose, and the intimacy of strategy became the intimacy of trust. They talked. For the first time, they truly talked. He told her about Charlotte, about their childhood at Thornfield, about the guilt that had driven him into exile. "I was her older brother," he said one evening, staring into the library fire. "I was supposed to protect her, and I was in London, attending some useless dinner, when she fell ill. By the time I arrived home, she was gone. I never said goodbye." Vivian listened. She did not offer platitudes. She simply sat across from him and held the weight of his words with her silence. "It was not your fault," she said at last. "Wasn't it? Grief is not guilt, Julian. You are allowed to miss her without punishing yourself for surviving." He looked at her, and something in his expression broke open. Not violently, but gently, the way a bud opens in the first true warmth of spring. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. It was the first time he had initiated contact. His fingers were warm, rough, certain. "How did you become so wise, Vivian Pembroke?" "Ashford," she corrected quietly. "Vivian Ashford." He smiled. A real smile, unguarded and full, and it transformed his face completely. The night of the ball, Thornfield House blazed with light. Every window was a beacon. Carriages choked Berkeley Square for 3 blocks. Vivian stood at the top of the grand staircase in the ivory gown. Her dark hair swept up simply, a single strand of emeralds at her throat, a gift from Lady Helena. Julian stood beside her in evening black, the Thornfield signet ring on his hand. Every inch the Marquess, but when he looked at her, his eyes held nothing of aristocratic distance. They held only her. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "Neither am I." He took her hand. "Together, then." "Neither am I." He took her hand. "Together, then together." They descended. The room fell silent. 500 pairs of eyes watched the lost Marquess of Thornfield walk down the staircase with an unknown woman on his arm. The whispers rose like tidewater. Lady Helena, stationed at the base of the stairs, beamed. The evening became a blur of faces, names, and careful conversation. Vivian moved through it with a poise she had not known she possessed, or perhaps had always possessed and never been allowed to use. Julian stayed close, his hand at her back, steady and sure. And then the doors opened, and her mother walked in. Lady Constance Pembroke was dressed in emerald silk, her chin lifted in defiant fury. Lord Devereux lurked behind her, thick-necked and sneering. They had not been invited. The music died. The crowd parted. Lady Constance's voice rang out across the ballroom. "There she is, my poor daughter, stolen from her family by a common laborer, a fraud who calls himself Wren." She advanced on them, her eyes wild. "This marriage is a sham. This man is no Marquess. He is a liar and a fortune hunter who preyed on a vulnerable girl." The collective intake of breath was audible. Lord Devereux stepped forward, his voice oily with false concern. "We have come to take her home. The annulment papers are being prepared. Lady Vivian will be my wife, as was always intended." Vivian felt the old fear rise in her chest like nausea. Her mother's fingers reached for her arm, sharp as claws. She looked at Lord Devereux's possessive eyes, at her mother's desperate, furious face. Then she looked at Julian. He was perfectly still. His face held the cold, absolute authority of a man whose family had held this title for 400 years. He looked at Lord Devereux's hand reaching for his wife, and his voice, when it came, was quiet enough to cut glass. "Remove your hand," he said, "or I will remove it for you." Devereux faltered. The room was utterly silent. Vivian gently took her mother's fingers from her arm. She stepped back, and she stepped toward Julian, and she laced her arm through his. The movement was small and deliberate and final. "Mama," she said, and her voice carried across the silent ballroom with a clarity that surprised even herself. "You are mistaken. This is my husband, Julian Ashford, Marquess of Thornfield. I am his wife. I chose him freely, and I would choose him again." She turned to Julian and smiled, not the brittle, performing smile her mother had spent years trying to teach her, but a real one, warm and certain. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." A single pair of hands began to clap. Lady Helena, standing near the fireplace, her eyes bright with tears she would never publicly acknowledge. Others joined. Lord Fenton, the Duchess of Bainbridge, then the room, swelling into applause that shook the chandeliers. Lady Constance stood frozen. Her scheme collapsed around her like a house of cards in a draught. She had come to expose a fraud, and had only succeeded in proving, before all of London, that her daughter had married one of the most powerful men in England. Lord Devereux, sensing the wind change, murmured something about a misunderstanding and vanished into the crowd. Vivian looked at her mother, standing alone in a sea of people who had already turned away, and she felt not triumph but sorrow. She saw a woman so consumed by fear of falling that she had pushed away the only person who might have caught her. Julian drew Vivian close. "Dance with me," he murmured. He led her to the center of the floor. The musicians struck up a waltz, and as 500 people watched, the Marquess and Marchioness of Thornfield danced. For Vivian, the room dissolved, the music, the glittering crowd, the crystal and candlelight. All of it fell away until there was only Julian, his hand steady at her waist, his green eyes holding hers with an expression so open, so unguarded, that it stole the breath from her lungs. "I love you, Vivian," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I think I have loved you since you stood on my doorstep and proposed to a carpenter with £40 and more courage than anyone I have ever known." "I love you, Julian," she whispered back. "My Marquess. My Carpenter. My husband." He kissed her then, in the center of the ballroom, in front of everyone and no one, because in that moment they were the only two people in the world. It was not a polite kiss, not a dutiful kiss. It was the kind of kiss that rewrites the ending of a story. 6 months later, the autumn light turned Thornfield Park to gold. The greenhouse was alive again, orchids blooming, ferns unfurling, the lemon tree heavy with bright fruit. Mrs. Finch, brought up from London at Vivian's insistence, now ran the kitchen with an iron hand and a warm heart. Nell, the girl who sang hymns while she worked, was training as the head gardener's assistant, her voice drifting through the grounds on clear mornings. Julian stood at the edge of the lake, skipping stones with Mr. Falk's grandson, a boy named Peter who'd been half-starved on Brier Lane and was now brown and healthy and loud with laughter. Julian looked up and saw Vivian watching from the terrace. He smiled, that easy, devastating smile she had first seen in a cramped hallway on Brier Lane, and raised his hand. She waved back. The emerald ring on her finger, the real one he had given her to replace the tin band, caught the light. She still kept the tin ring in a small box on her dressing table. She would always keep it. It was the truest thing she owned. In the library, on the mantelpiece, sat two portraits side by side. Charlotte laughing, forever young, and Vivian, quiet and steady, looking out with those brown eyes that saw too much and loved what they saw anyway. The past and the present honored equally, held in the same light. Julian climbed the slope to the terrace and pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about a man I saw in the rain," she said. "He gave his coat to a stray cat, and I thought, there is a person who knows that kindness is not a transaction. It is just a thing you do because the world is hard and you can make it slightly less so." He was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking about a woman," he said. "She knocked on my door with £40 and a proposition, and she made me remember that hiding from grief is not the same as healing from it." She turned to face him. "You were never invisible, Julian," she said. "Even when you were trying to be, I saw you. And you," he said, his voice rough with everything he felt, "were never invisible to me, Vivian. You were the only thing I ever truly saw." He kissed her, slowly, gently, in the amber light of an autumn afternoon, while below them the lake shimmered and the old house stood warm and breathing and full of life, and the ghosts that had haunted its halls rested at last, not forgotten, but finally, mercifully, at peace.